The sun hung low over the horizon, its golden rays painting the dusty landscape with streaks of light and shadow. James Walker, a 17-year-old with strong features and tired eyes, trudged along the narrow, deserted road. His sneakers kicked up small clouds of dirt as he walked, a worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. The day had been long, like so many others, and his muscles ached from hours spent hauling heavy crates at a temporary job on the other side of town. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat, but he didn't complain. Hard work was part of life, and James knew better than to shy away from it. The road was quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas and the faint rustling of the wind. James adjusted his baseball cap and glanced up at the sky. It was a cloudless blue, but there was no denying the chill creeping in as the evening approached. His thoughts wandered, as they often did during these walks, to his family and his dreams. Dreams that felt impossibly big for a boy like him, born and raised in a neighborhood that rarely saw opportunity. James' mother, Mrs. Evelyn Walker, was a woman of quiet strength. Her days were spent hunched over an old sewing machine in their living room, piecing together dresses and fixing worn-out shirts for neighbors who paid just enough to keep the lights on. She worked with dignity, humming soft gospel tunes as the needle clicked rhythmically. His father, Mr. Henry Walker, was a mason, his hands rough and calloused from years of laying bricks under the blistering sun. Together, they kept the family afloat, though just barely. James admired them both deeply. Their sacrifices were etched into his mind, motivating him to dream of a life beyond what they'd ever had. He was a good student, dedicated, sharp, and always at the top of his class when he could actually make it to school. But sometimes life demanded that he prioritize survival over grades. Missing a few days here and there to help his parents wasn't something he resented. It was simply the way things were. He sighed, running his hand along the strap of his backpack. The small wad of cash he had earned today, just enough to help buy groceries for the week, felt heavier than it should. One day, he thought, one day, I'll give Mom and Dad the life they deserve. As James rounded a bend, a strange sound up ahead broke his thoughts. He stopped in his tracks, his brows furrowing. It was faint, but distinct. The sound of tires skidding on gravel, followed by a soft thud. He squinted down the road, his heartbeat quickening. A glint of something shiny caught his eye, reflecting the last of the sun's rays. Curiosity tugged at him, though he knew better than to act recklessly. This part of town wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't exactly the kind of place where fancy cars or strangers were common. James took a cautious step forward, craning his neck for a better look. There, parked awkwardly on the side of the road, was a sleek black car, its pristine body and sharp lines out of place against the backdrop of dust and weeds. It wasn't just any car. Even from this distance, James recognized it instantly. A Tesla. His eyes widened. What on earth is a Tesla doing way out here? Something didn't sit right. A car like that belonged in the city, in front of towering glass buildings or parked beside sprawling mansions, not abandoned on a cracked and lonely road. James' instincts told him to keep walking, to mind his business and get home before dark, but his curiosity pulled him forward like an invisible thread. He scanned the area for movement as he approached. The car's back tire was completely flat, the rim tilted awkwardly into the gravel. Someone had stepped out of the vehicle. There were footprints in the dust leading around to the back. As he drew closer, James could see a man standing near the trunk, pacing and muttering under his breath. The man was white tall and dressed in dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Sunglasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and a gray cap was pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. The man's frustration was evident. He was fiddling with the trunk, yanking at it like it was stuck, swearing softly under his breath. James stopped a few feet away, just out of sight, and hesitated. His pulse quickened. Who was this man? And why was he struggling with something as simple as opening the trunk of a luxury car? The man kicked the ground lightly and looked around, as if searching for something or someone. James couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked, standing there in his expensive sneakers that probably cost more than James' entire wardrobe. For a long moment, James debated with himself. Stepping forward could be risky. His mother always said, "You don't know people's intentions, James. Don't go putting yourself in harm's way." But then again, walking away and leaving someone stranded didn't sit right with him either. He took a deep breath and made his decision. He cleared his throat softly and stepped into view. "Hey, sir," he called out, his voice carrying just enough over the quiet evening. The man jerked up in surprise and spun around, his sunglasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose. James froze, his stomach doing a somersault as recognition washed over him. Even without the cap and the shades, he would have known that face. It was him, the man whose photos were plastered on news outlets, magazine covers, and social media posts across the globe. Elon Musk. James blinked, momentarily stunned. What is Elon Musk doing out here? The billionaire's expression softened as he registered James standing there. He didn't say anything at first, just studied the teenager with a mix of curiosity and relief. James shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting by his sides. Finally, he managed to speak. "Do you need help, sir?" Elon tilted his head, as if trying to process the question. He raised one hand in a polite, almost sheepish gesture, his mouth twitching into a small smile. He didn't answer right away, but James could see the unmistakable look of hope in his expression. And just like that, the quiet evening had taken a turn James never could have predicted. James stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The man, Elon Musk, one of the richest and most talked about men in the world, was right there, just a few feet away. For a 17-year-old who'd only seen him in headlines, videos, and occasional magazine covers at the grocery store, the scene felt surreal. Musk looked out of place, like a figure cut out of a high-class cityscape and pasted onto this dusty, forgotten road. The Tesla, now clearly visible, was even more pristine up close. Its glossy black finish reflected the soft glow of the setting sun, and though its design was sleek, it looked helpless with its back tire flat, sagging sadly into the dirt. Musk, wearing his sunglasses and cap, shifted awkwardly and gave the trunk one final frustrated tug, muttering something to himself under his breath. James cleared his throat again. Sir, is everything okay with your car?" At the sound of his voice, Musk turned sharply and pulled down his sunglasses just slightly to get a better look at James. For a moment, they just stared at each other, an invisible wall of silence between the billionaire and the teenager who'd stumbled upon him. James wasn't sure if Musk had understood him. There was something about the man's gaze, distant yet thoughtful, that gave James pause. Finally, Elon spoke. "Tire. Flat," he said, his voice carrying a clipped edge to it, like he was piecing the words together. James could tell immediately that Musk's thoughts were somewhere else entirely, too preoccupied with his car or his impatience. Elon pointed to the back of the Tesla and shrugged, gesturing at the stuck trunk. "Tools. Can't get it open." James nodded, understanding now. He glanced at the car, then back at Musk. A Tesla, and no way to fix the tire, he thought with quiet amusement. For all its luxury and futuristic features, the car seemed helpless without basic tools, and its owner didn't look like the type to change a tire himself. "Well, I can take a look," James offered hesitantly. He took a step closer, dusting off his hands on his jeans. "If you don't mind, I've done this kind of thing before." Musk hesitated, blinking behind his shades as though trying to size James up. He seemed unsure at first, but when James pointed at the flat tire with confidence, Musk gave an exaggerated sigh of relief and gestured toward the car. "Please. Yes. Help." James walked over, circling the Tesla as if inspecting it for damage, though part of him just wanted to admire it up close. He'd never seen one of these in person before. Its curves were impossibly smooth, its rims shining like mirrors despite the dust clouds settling over everything else. "It's a beautiful car," James said softly, mostly to himself. Musk gave a small, absent nod. "Not so much now," he replied, rubbing his forehead and leaning back against the side of the Tesla. James hid a small grin, dropping his backpack onto the ground with a thud. The trunk was still refusing to open. Probably some kind of fancy automatic lock, James guessed. He tapped at the edges of the panel and spotted a small emergency release hatch beneath the bumper. "There's always a manual override," he murmured, prying it loose with a bit of effort. After a moment, the trunk clicked and popped open. Musk straightened up, pulling off his sunglasses to watch James with a mix of curiosity and surprise. "That was impressive," he said, almost to himself. James didn't respond. He was already sorting through the trunk, retrieving the jack and the tools needed to get the job done. He worked quickly and with purpose, kneeling beside the flat tire and loosening the lug nuts one by one. Musk watched in silence, still holding his sunglasses in one hand, clearly impressed by how efficiently James moved. "You've done this before?" Musk finally asked, breaking the silence. James looked up briefly, wiping sweat from his brow. "A few times. My dad's a mason. He works with his hands all day. He taught me how to fix things when I was younger. You kind of have to know this stuff. Where I come from..." Musk tilted his head thoughtfully, watching James work. "Where's that?" "Just down the road," James replied, nodding toward the direction he'd been walking from. "It's a small neighborhood. Nothing fancy." For a long moment, Musk didn't say anything. James focused on removing the flat tire, lifting it free with a grunt before positioning the spare. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it would get the car moving again. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. James liked the sound of tools clinking in his hands. It was familiar, grounding. We finally tightened the last bolt and lowered the car back down. James stood and brushed the dirt off his jeans. "That should do it. You'll want to get the tire replaced as soon as you can, though." Elon pushed off the car and approached, looking between James and the fixed tire with genuine admiration. "You did that fast. Really fast." He smiled, something genuine, though understated, and extended his hand. "Thank you. That really helped." James stared at Musk's outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it, feeling a little dazed. "No problem," he said quietly. Musk let go and stepped back toward the car, rummaging in his pocket. "Here," he said, holding out a small, rectangular card. James frowned, unsure of what to make of it. It wasn't a credit card. It was sleek and dark, with fine print James couldn't quite read in the fading light. "Take it," Musk urged, offering a small, grateful smile. "If you ever need something..." James blinked, stunned, but took the card and slid it into his pocket without a word. He wasn't sure what Musk meant by "if you need something," but it didn't matter. The man seemed genuinely thankful, and that was enough for him. "Thank you so much," Musk said once more, climbing back into the Tesla. The engine hummed softly, barely making a sound. Musk gave James one last glance, nodding approvingly, before pulling onto the road and driving away, his car vanishing into the horizon. James stood there alone, the card still tucked into his pocket, watching the dust settle. The whole encounter had been so quick, so strange, that it hardly felt real. He shook his head, chuckling softly to himself as he picked up his backpack. What a day, he thought, his lips curling into a small smile. He didn't understand the card or why Elon Musk had handed it to him, but it didn't matter, not yet at least. For now, James was just happy he'd been able to help. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James turned toward home, unaware that the simple act of kindness he'd shown today would set into motion something far bigger than he could ever imagine. As James walked the rest of the way home, the card in his pocket felt heavier with each step. The road ahead stretched endlessly under the deepening purple sky, but his mind lingered on what had just happened. He had fixed the tire of a Tesla, he reminded himself again, owned by none other than Elon Musk. It was surreal, like a story someone would tell around a dinner table but never quite believe. And that card, what exactly was it? Every so often, he slipped his hand into his pocket just to make sure it was still there. It felt cold and smooth between his fingertips, with an embossed weight that screamed importance. Musk's words echoed in his ears. If you ever need something, What could someone like James possibly need from a man like Elon Musk? Nothing, he thought, but it's nice to be noticed for once. By the time he reached the narrow streets of his neighborhood, the streetlights flickered to life, casting their weak yellow glow over cracked sidewalks and modest homes. He could already smell the faint aroma of his mother's cooking drifting through the air. Fried okra and cornbread, probably. That meant she'd had a decent sewing day. He smiled faintly as he trudged up the steps of their small house, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. The familiar sounds of the television buzzed faintly inside. His father, no doubt, catching up on the evening news. James opened the door, and the first person he saw was Mrs. Evelyn Walker. She sat at the small dining table under the dim kitchen light, a basket of fabric beside her, and a needle moving steadily in her hands. She looked up the moment he entered, her sharp eyes narrowing, as they always did when she thought he'd been up to something. "You're late, James," she said matter-of-factly, her tone clipped. She squinted at him, inspecting his dusty jeans and sweaty brow. "Where have you been? You didn't say nothing about staying late." James dropped his backpack beside the door and wiped his hands on his pants. I stopped to help someone on the road." His car had a flat tire. Mrs. Evelyn's needle paused mid-stitch. She tilted her head, her dark brows furrowing. "Someone who?" James hesitated, suddenly feeling ridiculous. He ran a hand over his cap and sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Mrs. Evelyn set down her sewing and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Try me." James glanced toward the living room, where his father sat in his recliner, eyes fixed on the news. Mr. Henry grunted in greeting, but didn't look away from the screen. Taking a deep breath, James blurted out it was Elon Musk. The room went quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the news anchor's voice from the living room. Mrs. Evelyn blinked once, twice, her face unreadable. Finally, she let out a sharp laugh, more incredulous than amused. "Elon Musk? Boy, have you lost your mind?" "I'm serious," James insisted, pulling the sleek black card out of his pocket and holding it up like evidence. The golden lettering glimmered under the kitchen light, catching his mother's attention. "I helped him fix his Tesla. His tire was flat, and he couldn't get the tools out of the trunk. He gave me this." Mrs. Evelyn's face shifted as she stared at the card. She reached out, taking it cautiously, as if it might disappear in her hands. Her thumb brushed over the embossed text, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What's this supposed to be? Some fancy business card?" "I don't know," James admitted. "He just said to take it and, if I ever need something." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes narrowed again, her skepticism hardening into something sharper. She set the card down on the table like it burned her fingers and shook her head. "You believe everything people say, son. Rich folks don't care about us. They hand out shiny things to make themselves feel better, and then they forget you exist the second you're out of sight." James frowned, his shoulders sinking slightly. "He didn't seem like that, Mom. He was nice. He was grateful." "Grateful? Umph," Mrs. Evelyn huffed, picking up her sewing again with a brisk, determined movement. "Grateful don't put food on this table, James. Grateful don't fix that leak in the ceiling or pay for your schooling." From the living room, Mr. Henry's voice rumbled, low and steady. "Who's this now?" "Elon Musk." James turned toward his father, hopeful that he might take his side. "Yeah, Dad. I told you. His car broke down and I helped him. He gave me that card as a thank you." Mr. Henry finally looked away from the TV, peering over the rim of his glasses at James. His expression was neither impressed nor dismissive. He was just tired, like everything else about him after a long day's work. "Rich man stuck on the side of the road, huh? Well, you did a good thing, son. That's what matters. Don't expect much more out of it, though." James sighed, shoving the card back into his pocket. He hadn't expected his parents to jump for joy, but the weight of their doubt felt heavy on his chest. He dragged his backpack to his bedroom, shutting the door behind him. The small space was filled with the familiar comforts of his life. Books stacked on his desk, a hand-me-down laptop that barely worked, and posters of the city skyline he dreamed of living in someday. James flopped onto his bed, pulling the card out one last time to study it in the pale glow of his bedside lamp. It didn't say much, just a name, a contact, and the faint logo of Musk's company. He traced the letters with his finger, wondering if he'd wake up tomorrow to find it was all just a weird dream. If you ever need something. The words felt distant, unreal, like a line from a movie he wasn't starring in. But even as doubt nagged at the back of his mind, a flicker of hope stayed alive in his chest. Maybe his mom was right. Maybe nothing would come of it. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the world was a little different now. With the card resting safely on his nightstand, James turned off the lamp and stared up at the ceiling. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the hum of crickets filling the night air. He closed his eyes and let himself imagine, just for a moment, that the card in his room might actually lead somewhere. The morning sunlight crept through the thin curtains in James' room, painting the walls with streaks of gold. He woke with a start, his mind immediately jumping back to the events of the previous evening. Sitting up in bed, he reached for the black card resting on his nightstand. It looked as mysterious as ever, its fine print catching the morning light. Did that really happen? James muttered to himself, running his thumb over the card's smooth surface. He knew it had. Every detail from Musk's frustrated pacing to the smooth hum of the Tesla was burned into his memory. Still, it felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. From the kitchen, James heard the clatter of dishes and his mother humming softly to herself. He quickly got dressed, shoving the card into the back pocket of his jeans and stepped out of his room. "Morning, Mama," he said as he entered the kitchen. Mrs. Evelyn was standing at the stove, her slender hands flipping cornbread pancakes with practiced ease. Her hair was wrapped tightly under a floral scarf, and her glasses sat low on her nose as she worked. "Morning," she said briskly, her tone clipped as it often was when something weighed on her mind. "You slept late. You're lucky your father's already gone to work, or he'd have you out helping him lay bricks." James grabbed a chair at the small kitchen table, drumming his fingers on the wood. "Yeah, I know." He glanced at the pancakes on the griddle, but Mrs. Evelyn wasn't giving him any. Not yet, he thought with a smirk. Breakfast was a reward, not a given, in the Walker house. After a long pause, Mrs. Evelyn spoke again without turning around. "You still talking about that rich man and his fancy car?" James sighed, slumping back in his chair. "It wasn't just any rich man, Mama. It was Elon Musk. I told you. And I told you," Mrs. Evelyn shot back, spinning around to face him with her spatula in hand. "Rich folks don't care about nobody but themselves. You think he remembers you this morning, James? I'll tell you what, he doesn't. You were just a boy on the side of the road to him. A quick fix to a problem." James frowned, frustrated but unsure how to respond. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the black card again, holding it up. "Then why did he give me this, huh? He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to say anything at all." Mrs. Evelyn stared at the card for a long, hard moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what that is, but it doesn't mean what you think it does," she said finally, her voice softening just slightly. "You've got a good heart, James. You always see the best in people, but you can't let yourself be fooled." "It's not about being fooled," James said quietly, running a finger along the card's edge. "I'm just saying, maybe he wasn't like that. Maybe he did care." Mrs. Evelyn sighed and turned back to the stove, flipping the last pancake onto a plate. "I just don't want you getting your hopes up. Hope's a dangerous thing when you don't have much to start with." She slid the plate in front of him, the smell of warm cornbread filling the air. "Eat up now. You've got school to get to." James looked down at the pancakes, his appetite dampened by the weight of their conversation. He couldn't blame his mother for her skepticism. Life had taught her to expect nothing from the world except what she could earn with her own two hands. Still, something inside him refused to let go of the tiny spark of possibility. As he ate in silence, James heard the muffled chatter of voices outside. He glanced toward the window and saw Mr. Whitaker, their elderly neighbor, chatting with some of the kids playing in the street. His neighborhood was always alive with sounds. Cars rumbling past, kids laughing, mothers calling their children back inside. It was home, but James couldn't help but wonder if there was something more waiting for him beyond these streets. Once he'd finished eating, James grabbed his backpack and stood up, slipping the card back into his pocket. "I'll see you later, Mama." Mrs. Evelyn didn't look at him, her hands already busy washing dishes. "Be good, James. And don't forget, dreaming's fine, but you've still got to live in the real world." James didn't respond. He stepped outside into the warm sunlight, the black card pressing against his leg like a quiet reminder of yesterday. The sounds of the neighborhood buzzed around him, bikes skidding on gravel, kids shouting across yards. But James' mind was elsewhere. As he walked towards school, he couldn't shake his mother's words from his mind. "Hope's a dangerous thing." But for the first time in his life, James wasn't sure he agreed. The next morning dawned warm and sticky, the kind of day where the air felt thick before the sun even fully climbed the sky. James was sitting on the front steps of his house, his worn backpack slung over his shoulder as he laced up his shoes. He hadn't told his friends at school about what happened with Musk yesterday. He could already hear their laughter, their teasing voices. "You fixed a billionaire's tire? What's next, dinner with Beyoncé?" His fingers tugged at the laces with extra focus. He hadn't seen his mother that morning. She was already bent over her sewing machine, the faint hum echoing through the house. His father had left at dawn, as always. Life moved on like nothing had happened. But James couldn't stop thinking about the black card tucked safely into the side pocket of his backpack. He shook his head to clear the thought. "Focus on school," he muttered to himself. Just then, a sound rippled through the quiet street. A low, deep rumble that didn't belong in this part of town. James froze mid-knot, turning his head toward the noise. From the far end of the block, a black SUV emerged, sleek and polished, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight. The SUV didn't belong here. The Walker neighborhood was filled with rusted sedans, pickup trucks that coughed smoke, and minivans held together with duct tape. Something like this, a gleaming beast of a car, didn't just show up without a reason. James stood slowly, his heart thudding in his chest as the SUV glided down the narrow street. It looked like something out of a movie, the kind of car where the people inside wore suits and sunglasses and rarely smiled. Across the street, Mrs. Peters peeked out from behind her curtains, her face shadowed by the glass. Kids playing with a basketball on the corner stopped and stared, their game forgotten. Even Mr. Whitaker, who sat on his porch every morning reading the newspaper, lowered the paper and squinted at the approaching vehicle. The SUV came to a slow stop directly in front of James' house. The engine purred softly, a sound that somehow seemed louder because of the silence it created. From the kitchen window, James heard the crash of something falling, a plate maybe, and his mother's voice calling sharply, "James." "Who is that?" "I don't know, Mama," James shouted back, though he didn't take his eyes off the car. The back door of the SUV opened, and two men stepped out. They were both tall, dressed in tailored black suits that looked stiff and expensive. James couldn't see a wrinkle or speck of dust on either of them, which somehow made them even more intimidating. They moved with purpose, their polished dress, shoes clacking softly against the pavement as they approached the steps. Mrs. Evelyn appeared in the doorway behind James, wiping her hands on her apron, her face drawn tight with concern. "Who are you people?" she called out, her voice firm but edged with fear. The man closest to the house smiled, a practiced, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He removed a slim envelope from inside his jacket and held out toward James. "James Walker?" he asked, his voice smooth and professional. James blinked, startled. Yeah, that's me." The man nodded, his smile widening just a fraction. "Good morning, James. Mr. Musk sends his regards. He would like you to accompany him to an event tomorrow." James' mind stuttered, the words tumbling over themselves before they registered. He stared at the man, then at the envelope, then back at the man. "Wait, what?" Mrs. Evelyn stepped forward, her apron crumpled in her fists. "What event? Who is this Mr. Musk? What do you people want with my boy?" The other man, who hadn't spoken yet, adjusted his tie and looked at Mrs. Evelyn with a steady, unreadable expression. "Ma'am, this is real. Mr. Musk remembers your son's kindness and would like him to be his guest at a private event. There's no cost to you. Transportation, food, and everything else will be arranged." James felt his heart pounding in his ears as he took the envelope from the man's hand. It was heavier than it looked, the paper thick and pristine, like nothing he'd ever held before. He turned it over and ran his thumb along the edge, afraid to open it. "This must be a scam," Mrs. Evelyn said sharply, her voice rising as she pointed a trembling finger at the men. "You think you can come into this neighborhood, hand out some shiny envelope and fool us? Rich folks don't care about people like us." The man's polite expression didn't falter. "This is no scam, ma'am. Mr. Musk is sincere in his gratitude." James looked up at the men, then back at his mother. His voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "Mama, they're telling the truth." Mrs. Evelyn turned on him, her face pale with worry. "And how do you know that?" "Because some fancy card and men in suits say so." "James, this ain't how the world works." James held up the envelope. "But Mama, what if it is?" A tense silence settled over the front porch. Across the street, neighbors were gathering on their lawns, whispering and pointing. The black SUV, with its tinted windows and menacing shine, stood like a shadow over the block, a silent promise of something big, something different. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she looked at the men again. If this is real, you'd better take care of my boy." One of the men nodded, his voice calm. "Of course, ma'am. You have our word." James looked down at the envelope in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know what lay inside, but for the first time in his life, something extraordinary felt within reach. Mrs. Evelyn's voice softened, though the worry in her eyes hadn't faded. "James," she said quietly, "just be careful." James nodded, swallowing hard as he looked back at the men. "I will, Mama. I promise." The taller man smiled again and gestured to the SUV. "We'll return tomorrow morning to pick you up. Have a good day, James." With that, the two men turned and walked back to the car, their movements as polished and precise as before. The SUV roared to life and rolled away, leaving a trail of stunned silence in its wake. James glanced at his mother, who was staring after the car with a look he couldn't quite describe, something between fear and hope. "James," she said softly, "what have you gotten yourself into?" James didn't have an answer. He just stood there, the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of something he couldn't yet name. Across the street, the neighbors were still staring, their whispers growing louder. And for the first time, James felt their eyes on him not with pity, but with something different, curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of awe. The night before the event, James could hardly sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of his small room, the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the curtains. The envelope, now torn open, sat on his nightstand, the invitation inside carefully smoothed and read a dozen times over. The letter was short and formal. "James Walker, you are cordially invited as a guest of Mr. Elon Musk to a private event on tomorrow's date. Transportation and all accommodations will be provided. Your attendance is appreciated." There was no further explanation, no hint of what kind of event it was, why he had been invited, or what any of this meant. That's what gnawed at him most. What was he walking into? From the other room, James could hear his parents' hushed voices carrying through the thin walls. His mother sounded worried, and his father's deep baritone was calm, steady as always. "Evelyn, let the boy go," Mr. Henry was saying. "You don't see doors like this open every day. You taught him to be smart. Trust that. And what if it's a trick?" Mrs. Evelyn snapped back. "Rich men don't just help folks like us. They don't even see us, Henry. You know that." There was a pause. "But what if they do this time?" Mr. Henry replied quietly. James closed his eyes and rolled onto his side, holding the small silver cross on the chain his mother had given him years ago. His father's words stuck with him. What'd they do this time? The next morning was alive with tension. James' house, usually quiet save for the hum of his mother's sewing machine, felt like the center of the neighborhood's attention. James stood nervously in the living room, wearing his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-up shirt that his mother had ironed twice over. The shirt didn't fit quite right, its sleeves a little too short, but it was the best he had. Mrs. Evelyn hovered nearby, clutching her hands together, while Mr. Henry sat quietly in the armchair, his expression calm but unreadable. Outside, the faint murmur of voices carried through the open window. The neighbors had gathered early. People peeked over fences and clustered in small groups, whispering excitedly. The entire block seemed to be watching James' house. Suddenly, the deep rumble of an engine broke through the chatter. James' heart leapt into his throat as he glanced out the window. The black SUV was back, gliding slowly down the narrow street like a shadow. Its polished surface reflected the morning sunlight and the faces of every neighbor who turned to stare. Mrs. Evelyn sucked in a breath, her fingers tightening around the small silver cross she wore around her neck. Lord, watch over this boy. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, and just like the day before, two sharply dressed men stepped out. One of them opened the back door, waiting silently. James swallowed hard and looked back at his parents. His mother's eyes glistened, though she was trying to hide it. "Mama," he said softly, "it's gonna be okay?" Mrs. Evelyn shook her head, her voice breaking just a little. "I don't know, James. It's just this feels too big, too sudden." Mr. Henry stood and walked over, placing a heavy hand on James' shoulder. "You be smart, son. Listen more than you talk. And don't forget where you come from." James nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Evelyn took a shaky step forward and pressed something into his palm. He looked down and saw the small wooden rosary he'd seen her hold so many times. "Keep this with you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "And don't let them take more than they give." James stared at the rosary, then back at his mother. "I promise, Mama." She nodded once, brushing her tears away quickly. "Go on, then, before I change my mind." James turned and walked out the door, the wooden steps creaking beneath his feet. The whole block was silent as he approached the SUV. He could feel eyes on him, neighbors he knew, kids he'd grown up playing ball with, mothers who had seen him run down these streets barefoot. "Where's he going?" someone whispered faintly. "Didn't you hear? Some billionaire came looking for him. They're going to trick that boy." James clenched the rosary in his hand as he reached the SUV. One of the men smiled politely and gestured toward the open door. "Ready, James." James hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at his house. His mother stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. His father stood beside her, a pillar of quiet strength. Taking a deep breath, James stepped into the SUV. The door shut softly behind him, and the world outside grew muffled. Inside, the car was cool and pristine, the leather seats soft beneath him. The two men climbed into the front seats without a word, and the engine purred to life. Through the dark-tinted windows, James caught glimpses of his neighbors, Mrs. Peters clutching her apron, kids frozen mid-basketball game, Mr. Whitaker squinting from his porch. The SUV pulled away slowly, leaving behind the only world James had ever known. As they turned the corner, James couldn't help but feel like something invisible had shifted. For better or worse, he wasn't the same boy who had walked to school yesterday. In the quiet of the car, James looked down at the rosary in his hand and then slipped it into his pocket, where it nestled against the black card Musk had given him. Two objects that felt worlds apart, yet here they were, together. "Where are we going?" James finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror and smiled faintly. "To the city, James. Mr. Musk is expecting you." James nodded slowly and leaned back against the seat, his thoughts a tangled mess. Outside, the neighborhood streets gave way to highways, and the landscape shifted from familiar to unknown. The SUV sped forward, taking James toward a world he could barely imagine. One where doors were opening, but where every step forward felt like walking into the unknown. The SUV glided smoothly onto the highway, the hum of its engine a constant, quiet companion. James sat still in the back seat, his fingers fidgeting with the small wooden rosary his mother had given him. He looked out the window as buildings began to rise on the horizon, distant and imposing, like silent guardians of a world he didn't belong to. For a moment, he let himself drift into thoughts of what awaited him. What does Musk want? He wondered. Why me? The black card, the invitation. None of it made sense. First time in a car like this, the man in the passenger seat asked suddenly, breaking the silence. James looked up, startled. Yeah, he admitted. First time in a car this nice, anyway. The man chuckled softly. Don't worry, kid. You'll get used to it. James didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and turned back to the window. Get used to it. He couldn't imagine ever being used to this kind of life. The idea felt like a foreign language, something just out of reach. When James returned home later that evening, after hours spent in a sleek city office meeting with Elon Musk's assistant and other professionals who'd explained something big was in store for him, his head buzzed with questions. Musk himself hadn't been there this time, but his name carried the weight of a mountain. Stepping back onto his familiar cracked street felt like entering another universe. The neighborhood, once loud and full of life, fell quiet the moment the black SUV rolled to a stop in front of James' house. James stepped out and looked around. Neighbors stood frozen on their porches and sidewalks, their eyes tracking his every move. A group of kids paused mid-game, the basketball bouncing away as they stared. Mrs. Peters stood at her gate, her wrinkled face pinched with suspicion. Mr. Whitaker, ever present on his porch, squinted over his newspaper and muttered something James couldn't hear. Who do they think he is now? Some celebrity? Someone whispered loudly from a few houses down. Looks like he's gotten himself into something strange, said another voice. James' cheeks burned. He hated how everyone was looking at him, like he was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. The SUV's door shut with a final thud behind him, and the men inside didn't say anything before driving away. He turned toward his house and found his mother standing on the porch again, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but James could feel her worry from where he stood. Inside, the conversation began almost the second he walked through the door. What do they want? Mrs. Evelyn demanded, stepping forward and gripping the edges of her apron. What did they tell you this time, James? James set his backpack down and sighed. They're inviting me to this thing. It's like an event. Important people are going to be there. And he hesitated, still processing it himself. Mr. Musk wants me there as his guest. I don't know all the details, but they said it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Mrs. Evelyn's frown deepened. An event. What kind of event? I don't know, Mama, James admitted honestly, his voice rising with frustration. They didn't tell me much, just that I should be there. Mrs. Evelyn pressed a hand to her forehead, shaking her head. This don't sit right, James. It just don't. Why would a man like that, who's got everything, be bothering with you? Mr. Henry, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table, finally spoke up. Maybe because he sees something in the boy, Evelyn. You ever think about that? Mrs. Evelyn turned sharply on her husband, her voice full of disbelief. Henry, you think a man like that sees us? People like us? He don't even know us. Mr. Henry didn't flinch. He looked straight at James, his expression serious. I think he knows enough. He knows the boy helped him when he didn't have to, and maybe that's enough. James felt his father's words settle deep in his chest, steadying him. He turned to his mother, his voice soft but determined. Mama, I want to go. I don't know why this is happening, but what if this is my chance? What if this is the thing that changes everything? Mrs. Evelyn's face crumpled slightly, her worry cracking through her strong front. She took a step toward James, her voice dropping to a near whisper. James, I just don't want you getting hurt. This world, it don't give us handouts, baby. You know that. James nodded, his heart heavy. I know, Mama, but this doesn't feel like a handout. It feels like something else. Like maybe I did something right. The room fell quiet, the weight of his words settling over them all. Finally, Mrs. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small silver cross she always wore, pressing it gently into James' hand. "If you're going, you keep this close to you. And don't forget where you come from. You hear me?" James nodded, his throat tight. "I won't, Mama. I promise." Mr. Henry stood and walked over, clapping James on the shoulder. "Be smart, son. Listen, learn. And remember, you don't owe nobody nothing but your best." James nodded again, grateful for his father's quiet strength. As the evening settled over the neighborhood, whispers grew louder. James could hear them through the open window as he sat on his bed, staring at the small rosary and the mysterious black card that had started all. "They're gonna trick the boy," said one neighbor. "What does a billionaire want with him? He's too young to know better." James closed his eyes, blocking out the noise. Somewhere deep inside, despite the doubt, the fear, and the confusion, a small voice told him to hold on, to trust that this was more than it seemed. Tomorrow, he would step into the unknown, and whether it led to something good or bad, James knew he couldn't turn back now. The next morning arrived with the faint glow of dawn slipping through the curtains of James' room. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling, the quiet weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. Today felt different, like the first step into a new life, though he wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. He swung his legs off the bed, his feet touching the cool wooden floor. His clothes were already laid out. The same press-button-up shirt from yesterday, paired with his cleanest jeans and a pair of shoes he'd scrubbed until they looked new again. He ran his fingers along the edge of the black card one last time before slipping it into his pocket, right beside the small rosary his mother had given him. When he stepped into the kitchen, his mother was already awake, standing at the stove. She turned when she heard him, her face soft but tired. "I made you something to eat," she said quietly, motioning to the small plate of eggs and toast on the table. James sat down, but his appetite was gone. He pushed the food around with his fork, stealing glances at his mother as she stood silently by the window, staring outside. She was waiting, watching for the car. Finally, she spoke. "You sure about this, James?" James set his fork down and looked at her. "I think so, Mama. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think I have to find out." Mrs. Evelyn turned toward him, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. "You listen to your gut. You hear me? If something don't feel right, you come home. Don't you let nobody make you feel small or ashamed of who you are." "I won't," James said softly. "I promise." She nodded once, then wiped her hands on a kitchen towel before stepping forward. She placed a hand on his cheek and looked him in the eyes. "You're my boy, James Walker. Always remember where you come from, no matter what you see out there." "I will, Mama." The faint rumble of an engine interrupted the moment. James' heart jumped as he glanced toward the window. The black SUV was back, gleaming and imposing as it rolled to a stop outside the house. "It's time," he said quietly. Mrs. Evelyn's hand lingered on his shoulder as they walked to the door together. Outside, the neighborhood was already stirring. Faces peered from windows, curtains twitched, and neighbors stepped onto their porches, whispering amongst themselves as the SUV idled at the curb. James felt every eye on him as he stepped down the creaking porch steps. Mr. Whitaker watched from his rocking chair, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. Kids leaned against bikes, frozen in place as they stared. The air felt thick with curiosity, doubt, and something James couldn't quite name, maybe envy. "Where's he going?" "They're taking him somewhere fancy, I heard." "Why him?" James' cheeks burned, but he kept walking, his mother just a step behind him. When they reached the SUV, one of the men stepped out. Sharp suit, dark sunglasses, expression as calm and unreadable as ever. He opened the door and gestured. "Good morning, James. Ready to go?" James turned back to his mother. She stared at the man with narrowed eyes, her lips pressed tightly together. Then, she looked at James, her voice soft but steady. "You be careful, baby. God's with you." "I will, Mama," James said. "I'll make you proud." She nodded, but didn't say another word as James climbed into the back seat. The door shut with a soft thud, and the world outside grew quiet again. James looked through the tinted window, seeing his mother still standing there on the porch, her arms crossed tightly around herself. The SUV pulled away, and soon his house, his neighborhood, faded into the distance. The ride to the city felt like entering another world. The cracked streets and humble houses gave way to smooth highways lined with gleaming billboards and towering trees. The landscape shifted, faster and faster, until the horizon was no longer just sky. It was skyscrapers. James pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his eyes wide as they approached the city. He had been to the outskirts before on school trips, but never here. The buildings were impossibly tall, glittering like they were made of diamonds. The streets were packed with cars, people moving fast, dressed in sharp suits and polished shoes. "Welcome to the city," the driver said casually, as though it wasn't the most impressive thing James had ever seen. James swallowed hard. "It's big." The man in the passenger seat chuckled. "It's something, all right. You'll get used to it. You'll get used to it." People kept saying that, as if someone like him belonged here. James wasn't sure he ever would. The SUV finally slowed as it turned onto a wide boulevard lined with trees. At the end of the street stood a hotel. No, not a hotel. A palace, almost. Its entrance was marked by tall golden doors, and the front drive was crowded with cars so fancy that James didn't even know their names. Valets in sharp uniforms darted between them, opening doors and helping men in suits and women in gowns step onto the marble walkway. James' mouth went dry. "What is this place?" The SUV stopped, and the man in the passenger seat turned to James. "We're here. Follow me inside." James stepped out onto the pavement, feeling completely out of place as he took in the grandeur around him. He adjusted his shirt nervously, clutching the rosary in his pocket as a wave of unease washed over him. Everyone here looked like they belonged, wealthy, confident, untouchable. And then there was him, James Walker, from a dusty road no one had ever heard of. "James!" The familiar voice startled him. James turned to see Elon Musk standing on the steps of the building, his sharp black suit tailored perfectly, a faint smile on his lips. He waved James over, and for a second, James froze. "He remembers me." James took a deep breath, steadied himself, and walked toward Musk. The billionaire extended a hand, his expression warm and friendly. "You're the boy who helped me, right?" James shook his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." Musk's smile widened. "Good. Come inside. We have something important to discuss." James followed him into the building, his heart racing with every step. The marble floors, the shimmering chandeliers, the distant hum of polite conversations, it all felt unreal, like walking into someone else's life. But James knew this much. Whatever happened next, his life would never be the same again. The massive lobby of the building swallowed James whole. The ceilings soared high above him, dripping with crystal chandeliers that shimmered like stars. The polished marble floors reflected everything: the golden lighting, the sharp-dressed guests, and James himself, a stark contrast in his simple clothes. People moved through the space with confident strides, their laughter and clipped conversations mingling into a murmur that felt foreign to him. Elon Musk strode ahead, his long steps purposeful, his crisp suit drawing subtle glances from others as he led James through the grandeur. James followed silently, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the marble, feeling as out of place as a lost shadow. "Nice place, isn't it?" Musk said casually, throwing James a glance over his shoulder. "Yeah," James muttered, trying to take everything in without staring too hard. "It's a lot." Musk grinned faintly. "You get used to it." There it was again. Those same words. "You'll get used to it." James wasn't sure he wanted to. They reached a set of double doors at the far end of the lobby. Two uniformed attendants swung them open, revealing a quieter, more private space. A lounge, James realized. Inside, the air felt cooler, the hum of the city outside muffled. Musk motioned for James to follow him to a seating area tucked beside a floor-to-ceiling window. From here, James could see the skyline stretching endlessly, buildings glowing with early morning light. "Take a seat," Musk said, lowering himself into one of the oversized leather chairs. James obeyed, sinking into a chair so soft it almost swallowed him. He tried to sit up straight, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in this room that smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Musk, by contrast, looked completely at ease, like he belonged everywhere he stepped. "You must be wondering why you're here," Musk began, his tone conversational but carrying a weight that made James' nerves tighten. "Yes, sir," James admitted, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I don't understand any of this." Musk chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "It's simple, James. People like me, people who are constantly on the move, solving problems, changing the world. Sometimes we get caught up in all. We miss things. The small moments. The small people." James blinked. "Small people." Musk held up a hand. "I don't mean that as an insult. What I mean is, someone like you wouldn't normally cross my path. But you did." He paused, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "You helped me when you didn't have to. You didn't ask for anything in return. I can count on one hand the number of times that's happened in my life." James shifted in his chair. "It's just how I was raised, sir. You see someone who needs help. You help them." Musk's eyes sharpened at that. "And that's exactly why you're here." James frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Musk reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thin tablet, setting it on the table between them. With a swipe of his fingers, he brought up images and documents James couldn't make sense of, diagrams of engines, blueprints, and photos of enormous machines that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. "You have potential, James," Musk said. "I've spoken to my team. I've seen what you did, fixing my car. That might seem small to you, but it wasn't. I know skill when I see it. Resourcefulness. That's rare." James stared at the images on the screen, struggling to connect Musk's words to his reality. I just fixed a tire, sir. Anyone could have done that." "Maybe," Musk replied, tilting his head thoughtfully. "But you did. And I don't believe in accidents." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "James, I want to offer you a scholarship." James blinked. "A scholarship?" "Yes," Musk said, his voice firm. "I want to give you the opportunity to study at one of the best technical schools in the country, an engineering and technology institute where kids go to learn how to build the future. Everything will be covered: tuition, housing, books, food, everything. You'll learn from the best. You'll become the best." The words hung in the air like thunder. James stared at Musk, his mind struggling to keep up. "You're offering me a scholarship to study engineering?" Musk nodded, his expression steady. "That's right. You have talent, James. It might still be raw, but I can see it. And I want to help you turn it into something real. Something that can change your life. Change the lives of your family. Maybe even more." James' heart pounded in his chest. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. "But I don't know anything about places like that," he said softly, almost to himself. "I don't belong there." Musk leaned back again, his gaze sharp but kind. "Let me tell you something, James. I didn't come for money either. I wasn't born into success. I worked for it, and I kept pushing until I made a place for myself where I didn't belong." He pointed at James. "You have to decide for yourself if you're going to step into that world or stay where you are. No one's going to force you. But this door, it doesn't open twice." James looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the rosary in his pocket. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't let them take more than they give." "But why me?" James whispered, looking back up at Musk. "Out of everyone you could have helped, why me?" Musk smiled faintly. "Because you were there, James. And because you helped me without asking why." James swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He thought of his mother's tired hands working that old sewing machine. He thought of his father's rough, calloused palms after a long day of laying bricks. He thought of their sacrifices, their hope that he'd build something better for himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I'll do it." Musk's smile widened. "Good. You won't regret it." James sat back in his chair, his mind still spinning. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something bigger. And he was ready to step forward. The black SUV rolled back into the neighborhood just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the small houses and cracked pavement in a warm orange glow. James sat in the back seat, his heart pounding as he gripped his backpack in his lap. The invitation letter, now slightly crumpled from his nervous hands, was tucked safely inside. As the SUV slowed to a stop in front of his house, James could already see his mother on the porch, arms crossed, her silhouette sharp against the fading sky. The neighbors, as expected, were watching again. Whispers floated on the evening air. "There he is. What's he got in that bag of his? Is it money? What did they promise him?" James tried to ignore them as he climbed out of the SUV. The driver gave him a polite nod before pulling away, leaving James standing alone in front of the small, worn house he called home. The world behind him, the shining city, the polished halls, felt like a dream now. This was reality, with its chipped paint and creaking steps, and his mother's eyes burning with both worry and curiosity. "James Walker," Mrs. Evelyn said as he approached. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the same one she used when he stayed out too late or came home with torn clothes. "Get yourself inside right now and tell me what this is all about." "Yes, ma'am," James muttered, his throat dry. The living room was dimly lit, the faint hum of the sewing machine still buzzing in the background where Mrs. Evelyn had left it. Mr. Henry was already sitting at the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of water. He looked up when James entered, his steady eyes holding a quiet question. James stood in the center of the room, clutching his backpack as though it might hold him up. Mrs. Evelyn followed him in, shutting the door firmly behind her. "Well," she pressed, "speak, boy. What did those people want with you?" James swallowed hard and unzipped his backpack, carefully pulling out the letter. It looked so small, so thin, for something that carried so much weight. He handed it to his mother without a word, watching as she unfolded it. Her eyes skimmed the page, and at first her expression didn't change. Then her brows furrowed, her mouth opened slightly as she read further. When she reached the end, she lowered the letter and looked at James. "What's this?" she asked softly, as though afraid to believe what she'd just read. Mr. Henry held out his hand. "Let me see that." She handed the paper to him, and he read it silently, his lips moving faintly as he took in every word. When he was done, he set the letter down on the table and looked at James, his face unreadable. "Explain this to us, son." James' voice trembled as he started. "Mr. Musk, he's offering me a scholarship to a school, an engineering school. Everything's paid for. Tuition, housing, food, everything. He said he wants to help me become something. He thinks I have potential." The room fell silent. Mrs. Evelyn sank slowly into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. Her voice came out faint, barely above a whisper. "A scholarship." "Yes, ma'am," James said, his heart thudding. Her shoulders began to shake. James stepped forward, panic rising in his chest. "Mama, are you okay?" Mrs. Evelyn lifted her head, tears streaking down her face. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, as though the boy she had raised in this small, worn-out house had suddenly turned into someone else, someone bigger. "My boy," she choked, reaching for him. James knelt beside her, and she cupped his face with trembling hands. "My boy is going to study with the best. You hear me? You're going to study with the best." James felt his throat tighten, and he blinked back tears. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make you proud. I promise." From across the room, Mr. Henry stood slowly, the old wooden chair creaking beneath him. He walked over, his face calm, but his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He placed a heavy, steady hand on James' shoulder. "God saw your effort, son," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He saw how you help people, how you work hard. And this is your chance. Don't waste it." "I won't, Dad," James said, his voice cracking. For a moment, they just stood there, Mrs. Evelyn wiping her tears, Mr. Henry's hand firm, reassuring weight on his shoulder. Then suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Mrs. Evelyn stiffened, and James' head turned sharply toward the sound. "Who's that now?" she muttered, rising quickly to wipe her face with the edge of her apron. James opened the door to find Mr. Whitaker standing on the porch, his old hat in his hands. Behind him, the faint glow of the streetlights illuminated the small crowd of neighbors gathering once again. "Well," Mr. Whitaker grunted, squinting at James. "What's all this talk about a scholarship?" James glanced over his shoulder at his parents, who nodded for him to speak. He stepped outside, clearing his throat as the neighbors' murmurs quieted. "It's true," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Musk, he offered me a scholarship to study engineering. Everything's paid for. I'm going to get an education." For a moment, the crowd was silent, as though they didn't quite believe him. Then, the whispers began to ripple. "Did you hear that? The boy's got scholarship. A scholarship from Elon Musk. Lord have mercy. He's going to make something of himself." Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly, a rare smile cracking through his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. Good for you, boy. You go make us proud now, you hear?" From across the street, Mrs. Peters called out, her voice sharp but impressed. "Don't you forget about us little folks when you're off building spaceships." Laughter erupted, the tension breaking like a dam. James smiled sheepishly, his heart swelling as neighbors clapped his back and called his name. Kids cheered and chased each other through the yard. For the first time, their eyes weren't filled with doubt or suspicion. They were filled with pride. James stepped back into the house, shutting the door behind him as the sounds of celebration drifted through the window. Mrs. Evelyn was still wiping her face, her eyes red but shining with joy. Mr. Henry sat back down at the table, shaking his head in quiet wonder. James took a deep breath, the weight of it all sinking in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, his neighborhood, everyone who had ever hoped for something more. And as he sat down at the table with his parents, the rosary still clutched in his hand, he made himself a silent promise. "I won't waste this chance. I'll make it count for all of us." The day James left for school was unlike any other. The morning air carried a sense of excitement mixed with nervousness. Suitcases, borrowed from neighbors, sat neatly packed at the door. Inside, Mrs. Evelyn wiped down the kitchen counters one last time, her movements unusually slow. Mr. Henry leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, staring off into nothing as if measuring the weight of what this day truly meant. James adjusted the collar of his shirt, the rosary tucked safely under it. He was ready, or as ready as he could be. He turned to his mother and father, his voice steady but soft. "I'll call you as soon as I get there. I promise." Mrs. Evelyn looked up, her eyes glassy. She stepped forward, smoothing her hands over James' shoulders as though fixing something invisible. "You're going to do great things, baby," she whispered. "I know you are." James nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'll make you proud, Mama." "I already am," she said, choking on the words before pulling him into a tight hug. Mr. Henry stepped up next, gripping James' hand firmly. His voice was calm and certain, like a foundation James could stand on. "Be strong, son. You'll see a lot of things out there, some good, some bad, but don't let it change who you are. You understand?" "Yes, sir," James said, holding back the lump in his throat. The black SUV arrived soon after, idling at the curb like it had on so many mornings before. But this time, James was leaving for something far bigger. As he climbed into the back seat, he turned to wave at his parents one last time. His mother stood on the porch, clutching the edge of her apron tightly, while his father raised a hand in quiet farewell. The SUV pulled away, and James watched through the window as his home, his neighborhood, grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. The school campus was nothing like James had ever seen. The sprawling grounds were dotted with massive glass buildings that seemed to sparkle under the sun. Lush green lawns stretched endlessly, lined with paths where students walked briskly in groups, wearing clothes that screamed wealth and confidence. James felt his stomach tighten as he stepped out of the SUV. His sneakers crunched against the gravel driveway, and his worn duffel bag hung awkwardly from his shoulder. Around him, cars that cost more than his entire house parked in neat rows, driven by students who barely looked older than he was. A man in a gray blazer approached with a polite smile. "James Walker." James nodded. "Yes, sir." "Welcome to the Institute," the man said, shaking his hand. "We're so glad to have you here. Follow me, and I'll show you to your dorm and get you settled in." As James followed him across the campus, he couldn't stop staring. Everything here was so pristine, so expensive, so perfect. Students zipped past on electric scooters, chatted on sleek tablets, and wore watches that probably cost more than his family's monthly income. He tugged nervously at the strap of his bag, feeling like an outsider. "Here's your dorm," the man said finally, stopping in front of a modern building with tall glass windows. "Your room is upstairs. You'll have a roommate. Don't worry, he's a great student. Classes start tomorrow, but orientation will give you a chance to meet your professors and classmates." "Thank you," James mumbled, stepping into the building. His room was small but clean. 2 beds, 2 desks, and a large window that overlooked the campus. One side of the room was already neatly decorated with posters of technology companies and a shelf lined with trophies. Clearly his roommate had been here before. James dropped his bag on the empty bed and sat down heavily, staring at the walls. Everything felt unfamiliar. "This isn't home," he thought. A voice startled him. "You must be James." James looked up to see a boy standing in the doorway. He was tall, pale, and wearing a branded hoodie James recognized from a designer store. The boy smiled faintly, his expression somewhere between polite and curious. "I'm Carter, your roommate." He set down his expensive-looking backpack and extended a hand. "Nice to meet you." James shook it, unsure of what to say. "Nice to meet you, too." Carter glanced at James' duffel bag, then back at him. "So, where are you from?" "Just a small town," James replied quickly, his cheeks burning. He didn't want to get into details. Carter seemed to sense the tension and shrugged. "Well, welcome to the Institute. You're lucky. People kill to get in here." James nodded, but he couldn't help feeling out of place. Carter had probably grown up in houses with libraries bigger than James' entire home. He probably didn't know what it was like to come from nothing, to wonder if there'd be enough money for dinner at the end of the month. That night, as James lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The other students here belonged in this world. They spoke differently, carried themselves with confidence, and seemed to know exactly what they wanted. James wasn't sure he belonged at all. "What am I doing here?" he wondered. But then, he thought of his parents, his mother's tears, and his father's quiet strength. He thought of the rosary tucked safely under his pillow. "They believe in me," he told himself. "I have to believe in me, too." The first week of classes was harder than anything James had ever imagined. His professors moved fast, tossing around words he didn't recognize and assigning projects that left him awake until the early hours of the morning. His classmates seemed to breeze through everything, rattling off answers with the kind of confidence James couldn't fake. One afternoon, after struggling to fix a small circuit during his engineering lab, James sat alone at his workstation, sweat dripping down his face. Around him, the other students worked in pairs, laughing and chatting as they finished their projects. Carter walked over, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Hey, James, you okay?" James looked up, embarrassed. "Yeah, just trying to figure this out." Carter glanced at the mess of wires and smiled faintly. "Here, let me show you." He knelt down and walked James through the steps, his explanations clear and patient. By the time they were done, the circuit worked perfectly, and James couldn't help but smile. "Thanks," he said softly. Carter shrugged. "Don't worry about it. You'll get there. You're smart. You wouldn't be here if you weren't." James stared at him, surprised by the words. No one here had said anything like that to him before. "Yeah," James muttered, more to himself than Carter. "I'll get there." And as he packed up his tools, he thought again of his parents, his neighborhood, and the promise he'd made to himself. No matter how hard it got, he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. This wasn't just about him anymore. Years passed, but the memory of where James came from never left him. He had spent countless late nights in labs, pushing himself harder than he thought possible. He became known as the student who never quit, staying after class, asking questions, reading textbooks until the print blurred. He had struggled to fit in at first, surrounded by students who grew up with private tutors and endless resources, but he had something they didn't, an unshakable drive born from knowing what it meant to have nothing. By the time James graduated, he wasn't just another name on a list. He had become one of the top students in his program, known for his innovative engineering projects and ability to think creatively under pressure. Professors spoke of his talent with admiration, and companies began to take notice of the young man who had come from nowhere and outshined expectations. But despite the job offers and opportunities laid at his feet, James knew exactly where he needed to go first. The neighborhood hadn't changed much when James returned. The cracked sidewalks were still there, the streetlights still flickered after dark, and the small houses sat in their rows, paint peeling in places but standing strong. Kids still played ball in the narrow streets, their laughter echoing through the air, and mothers still called from porches when the sun started to set. James stepped out of the car, a modest sedan this time, no black SUVs, no men in suits, and looked around. He was older now, taller, with a quiet confidence in his step. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, his bag slung over his shoulder, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had learned. "James." The voice broke through the stillness. Mrs. Peters was standing in her yard, squinting through her glasses, her face breaking into a wide smile as she realized who it was. "Well, look who decided to come home." James grinned and waved as neighbors began peeking out from their windows and doors, their voices bubbling with excitement. "It's James Walker's. Look at him now. Boy done grew up, didn't he?" He made his way up the familiar steps to his parents' house. The door swung open before he could knock, and there stood Mrs. Evelyn, her hand flying to her mouth as she took him in. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hey, Mama," James said softly, smiling as he stepped inside. She pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as though afraid he might disappear again. "My boy," she said through tears. "My boy is home." Mr. Henry appeared in the doorway of the living room, his face breaking into a rare, proud smile. He walked forward, clapping James on the shoulder with a firm, steady grip. "Welcome back, son." "Thank you, Dad," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." That evening, word spread fast. Neighbors gathered on porches and in front yards, forming small clusters of people curious about James' return. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting everything in gold as kids darted between the adults, laughing and shouting. James stood on the small porch of his family's home, looking out at the faces he'd grown up with. There was Mr. Whitaker, still seated in his rocking chair, and Mrs. Peters with her sharp voice and soft heart. Young boys who reminded him of himself stood near the curb, watching him with wide, curious eyes. James cleared his throat, nervous for the first time in a long while. "I've been gone for a few years," he started, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "But this place, this neighborhood, has always been home to me. Everything I'm started right here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "When I left, I promised myself that I'd come back and do something that mattered, something that could help all of us, not just me." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him so intently. "I know what it's like to feel like opportunities don't exist, to feel like the world forgot about us. But I want to change that. James gestured behind him, where blueprints and plans sat neatly rolled up on a table. "I'm building a center, a technology and learning center right here in our neighborhood. A place where kids can learn about engineering, technology, and building the future. A place where they'll have opportunities one never had." The crowd stirred, whispers breaking out among the neighbors. "It's going to be free for everyone," James added quickly. "Funded by people who believed in me. Now, I'm bringing that belief here to you, to us." The words hung in the air for a moment, like a spark waiting to catch fire. Then Mrs. Peters, her voice shaky but loud, said, "Lord have mercy. He's really doing it." A cheer erupted, small at first, but growing louder as neighbors clapped and shouted their approval. "You're making us proud, James. That's what this neighborhood needs." James smiled, his heart full as he looked out at the people who had raised him, the community that had shaped him. The young boys near the curb watched him like he was something more than just James Walker from the dusty road, like he was a possibility, a sign that they could be more, too. As the crowd began to disperse, James stepped down into the yard where his mother waited. Her eyes shone with tears, but her smile was bright and unwavering. "You did good, baby," she said softly. "Real good." James slipped his hand into his pocket, feeling the small rosary still tucked there, and looked back at his parents' house. The house that had seen so much struggle, so much love. "It all started here, Mama," he said. "It's only right that I bring it back." The following months were a whirlwind. Construction began quickly, with James at the center of it all, talking to builders, organizing supplies, and watching as his plans slowly took shape. Kids from the neighborhood would ride their bikes to the site, pressing their faces against the fence to watch the workers, wide-eyed with curiosity. When the center finally opened, the sign above its doors read, "The Walker Technology Center, building tomorrow together." The neighborhood changed after that. Kids had a place to go after school, a place to learn coding, robotics, and mechanics. James brought in mentors, volunteers, and tools no one in the community had ever seen before. The center became a hub of hope, a symbol of what could happen when someone believed in the impossible. On opening day, as James stood at the entrance, shaking hands with families and young kids, a familiar black SUV pulled quietly up to the curb. The door opened, and Elon Musk stepped out, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans. James smiled, walking over to greet him. "You did it," Musk said, looking up at the shining new center. "We did it," James corrected, shaking Musk's hand. "You gave me the chance. I just ran with it." Musk nodded approvingly, glancing at the kids darting through the doors of the building. "This is impressive, James. You've created something real here." James looked back at the center, his chest swelling with pride. "It's just the beginning." And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the neighborhood in gold, James knew that the dream he had carried for so long had finally come true. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. It was about his family, his neighbors, and every kid who needed to see that it was possible to break through the walls life had built around them. James Walker, once just a boy from a dusty road, had become the light his community needed, and he wasn't finished yet.